Let's talk a little bit about civil liberties during the Great Depression. Remember in the 1920s, we were talking about how communists and socialists were being persecuted. You even had the Red Scare, 1919 going into 1920. And so there was all of this negative perceptions being projected onto communists and socialists, right? Well, as we move into the 1930s, you're going to see communists and socialists gain more prominence, becoming more popular in the United States. Okay. One example of this is the formation of something called the Popular Front. And in this case, the Popular Front is referring to a coalition of people who support the New Deal, right? They support this direction that the government is going in, like intervening in society, trying to help the economy, trying to address inequalities, right? And so you have people who support the New Deal as part of the Popular Front, but you also have communists and socialists who are part of the Popular Front, right? And so all these different ideologies and organizations are working together. That's why it's the Popular Front, because they're trying to address inequalities in society. So the Popular Front, we'll talk a little bit more about the Popular Front in a second. You also have the promotion of cultural pluralism more in the 1930s. Remember, we talked a little bit about cultural pluralism already. And so you have organizations like the American Jewish Committee and the National Conference of Christians and Jews promoting the idea that ethnic diversity is a good thing. It's an American thing. Okay, ethnic diversity is actually a key aspect of American culture, right? That's what makes America, that it's so diverse, that you have people from a number of different ethnic backgrounds, right? It adds to the richness of American culture, right? And so you see these organizations working to promote this idea of cultural pluralism. Okay, so this is a perspective that's being supported, and the idea is that it's going to weaken racism and discrimination towards immigrants. Okay, all right. So on that same topic of discrimination and racism, let's talk a little bit about the Scottsboro case. So here you see the Communist Party stepping in and working to publicize this case to try to bring it to international attention about the racial inequalities that exist in the American legal system. Okay, so what is the Scottsboro case? Well, okay, this is a case that involved 9 African-American teenagers who were accused of raping white women, these 2 white women in Scottsboro, Alabama. And there's really not that much evidence against them, but this is taking place in Scottsboro, Alabama, right? This is in the South, heavily racial environment, all white jury, the death penalty is on the line, all right? Now, although several of the defendants were eventually found guilty, right? And this is a long process. This case was publicized, like I said, internationally. A lot of attention on the case. A lot of people were shocked at the racial inequalities that exist in the legal system. But there were several of the defendants ultimately were found guilty, but they didn't get the death penalty. Okay, they did serve some time, though. There were some who served as long as 13 years in jail. But there was some positive aspects to the outcome of this case, because the case was tried 3 times. Okay, that means that these teenagers were put on trial 3 separate times and found guilty every time, right? Well, the first 2 rulings were appealed, and it eventually went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court found that you could not have racial bias against who could be on the jury. Because remember, in the South, African Americans were not allowed to sit on juries, right? And so in one of these appeals cases relating to the Scottsboro case, the Supreme Court found, or actually overturned, the convictions because there were no African Americans on the jury. Okay, and this goes against the 6th Amendment, which guarantees the right to every American citizen to a fair trial. So that was one of the cases where the guilty verdict in the Scottsboro case was overturned by the Supreme Court. Okay, another reason why the Scottsboro verdict got overturned in the Supreme Court on a separate occasion was because the lawyers that represented the Scottsboro defendants, right, the defendants in the Scottsboro case, were not properly prepared. They were not properly prepared, and so the court ruled that the verdict needed to be overturned, right? That they couldn't convict these teenagers in the Scottsboro case because their lawyers were not prepared. So out of that ruling from the Supreme Court, it was decided that all defendants in the United States had the right to have proper legal representation. So there were a couple of important decisions that came out of the Supreme Court related to the Scottsboro case, okay? And finally, it also started to seem like the government itself was trying to get involved in protecting civil liberties, right? So there's the creation of the Civil Liberties Unit, right, which is a division within the Department of Justice. And so the Civil Liberties Unit is focused on a number of different types of cases, but they're really focusing on cases that are protecting rights like the freedom of speech, labor rights, voting rights. Okay, so it seems like this is a step towards the government working to protect people's liberties, to protect people's rights. But as the government seemed to be supporting civil rights and civil liberties, the rights of workers, at the same time, you have Southern politicians, congressmen, who begin to pull their support from the New Deal and pull their support from FDR, right? President Roosevelt. And keep in mind, President Roosevelt is a Democrat, right? He's not a Republican, he's a Democrat. And the Democratic Party is the biggest party in the South. It dominates the South, right? So these Southern politicians that I'm talking about, they're Democrats, right? And FDR is a Democrat, but you start to have Southern politicians pulling their support from FDR and the New Deal because they don't like the direction that it's going in, okay? And so this is going to slow down the momentum of FDR's policies. So with the actions of these Southern politicians who are not wanting to support the New Deal anymore because it might give too much power to racial minorities, it might uplift economically racial minorities and upset the racial hierarchy that is existing in the South at the time, you start to see that shift taking place, right? So now when you look at it that way, it's like, well, maybe the government isn't supporting civil liberties, right? And the Communist Party is another example of this. Remember, I said the Communist Party is part of the Popular Front, right? And during the 1930s, you're going to see kind of a resurgence in the Communist Party. More members. You have like at least 100,000 members in the Communist Party throughout the country in the United States. But as another example of how civil liberties are going to get stepped on by the government eventually, the Communist Party is eventually going to get cracked down upon by the government as you see the creation of the House Un-American Activities Committee, okay, which is going to crack down on communist members. They're going to be brought before the committee. They're going to be grilled in public. They're going to get blacklisted. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the Cold War. So on one hand, yes, government is trying to support civil liberties, but on the other hand, you have members of the government who are doing just the opposite.